So welcome to our session on climate finance justice for the Confronting the Climate Crisis with Systemic Alternatives in the Age of Coronavirus Nearly Carbon Neutral Conference through UCSB. I'm Lauren Gifford. I am affiliate faculty at the university, at Metropolitan State University in Denver. And I am a visiting researcher with the Environmental Justice and Climate Justice Hub at University of California, Santa Barbara, who is hosting this conference. So I brought two of my colleagues together, Chris Knudson, who's in Hawaii, and Laura Sauls. Laura, what university are you at now?
I'm now at the University of Sheffield in the UK.
Cool. So we have all contributed to a special issue of the journal Climatic Change on the topic of climate finance justice. The title of the journal is Climate Finance Justice, International Perspectives on Climate Policy, Social Justice, and Capital. So today we're going to have about a 20-minute conversation just addressing three different questions. The first is, why is climate finance justice an important subfield? Like, why do we care about it? Why did we do a special issue on it? Why should you care about it? The second is that trends that we've noticed in the field and that we've seen emerging as dominant spaces of inquiry. And then finally, where we see the field going or interesting research that we've seen recently that we're excited or inspired by. So I think we can just get started here. And with that first question is, why is climate finance justice an important subfield? Chris, I know you have some thoughts on that. You were the co-editor of the special issue. This grew from a session that we did at the AAG a few years ago, the American Association of Geographers annual conference. And that was totally your idea. So this is something that you've been thinking about for 3-4 years at least.
Yeah, so I've been doing work on insurance and derivatives, that sort of these more high-tech forms of finance that are targeted at very low-income people in the global south to manage the increasing risks of climate change. And so what I see is that both climate change and finance, particularly around the way that it can actually marginalize people, increase inequality, that these two big fundamental issues that have both justice implications, but also these huge real-world implications. And they're both increasing, and they both need to be managed, and they have justice components. And then to see them together almost like multiplies the complexity and the necessity to make sure that the justice dimensions are dealt with. And
right, there's a lot of power when environmental management is rolled out through these very complex financial instruments,
right,
that are framed as development aid or conservation finance. But really, there's so much complexity, and they, like I said, they maintain a lot of power over environmental governance. And I really think it's worthy actually studying sort of these instruments and their justice components and the uneven power relationships that are inherent within them.
Yeah, so I would just add to that. Yeah, so with these derivatives, like they're tied to satellite data and they're financial derivatives, but they actually are kind of sold on a lie. I mean, they're called insurance, but they're not insurance. And so there's this obfuscation to make it easier for them to be sold. And so that's also my concern with finance, is that it often obfuscates what's really going on. And they're actually deliberately complicated in order to make sure that only the elites manage it, that you can funnel it in certain ways. And that's also my concern, because justice needs to be, like, people need to evaluate what they're getting into. Part of justice is that you have the full information to make a choice depending on what's good for you. And if you think that these index insurance things are like insurance, but then they don't pay out, what I studied, you could have a storm, you could have losses, but they don't pay out unless the satellite data reads a certain amount of rainfall. So it's irrelevant how much you actually lost. It's only what the satellite sees, right? So that's a justice implication, that if you just call it insurance and obfuscate that, and they don't realize it is more complicated. So to me, it's like those issues, when you bring complex finance in, there's these immediate justice issues for the people that you're selling it to.
And I feel like we just jumped right in, and I forgot to point out that we are all on like 3 corners of the planet. So that we all do research in different places. So I introduced myself, and I'm here in Colorado. I do research in Maine. I've done research in the Peruvian Amazon. I've done research at the UNFCCC meetings all around the world. And then Laura, tell us where you are and where your work is.
So I'm an early career researcher at the University of Sheffield in the geography department. And I'm also an affiliated researcher with the extractives at Clark Research Group at Clark University. And my research is really focused in Central America. I look at kind of regional partnerships around territorial rights and climate change, and specifically thinking about what does it mean for who gets to be at the table when it comes to deciding on forest finance, for example, or climate finance. How are the lines on the map drawn around what is a forest and not? And that has a lot to do with who then is going to benefit from some of these complex mechanisms that generate from the UNFCCC, for example. And I'll also note, I actually spent a couple of years on the US negotiation team at the UNFCCC, right around the Cancun meetings. And so I also have that perspective of kind of really who gets to be in the room is sometimes 24-year-olds with a master's degree and no real experience dealing with any of the complex challenges on the ground of making a life and a living in the face of climate change. So it's part of where I've come, how I've arrived at some of these questions and concerns.
Chris, how about you?
So I'm in Hawaii, as you mentioned, on Hilo in the Hawaii island. And the insurance work I was talking about was in the Eastern Caribbean. And I'm also doing work now in Jamaica. So sort of tropical islands, largely people working in agriculture. And so in addition to this sort of finance work I've been doing more work on environmental justice actually here in Hawaii around water justice and the return of water to streams after the end of sort of colonial sugar. So those sort of two poles of environmental justice and finance around climate change are still sort of driving my work. And
so Laura, before we just move on to the next question, did you want to add why? I know before we start recording, you had some good insights. Do you want to add a little bit about why you think we should study climate finance justice or why it's an important subfield?
Sure, and Chris always says things so beautifully, and I've said that before, but especially given my very early career experience in the UNFCCC and hearing about these hundreds of billions of dollars being bandied about as pledges of what climate finance should flow, you know, there's a lot of concern about, well, who's going to provide that finance? And that links, of course, into this idea of the historic debt of the global north to the global south. But then there's also the side of who's eligible to receive climate finance. And so much of the time, the folks who are well positioned to receive that finance are not the folks who are most going to be able to use it in a way that is actually going to confront the challenges of either mitigation or adaptation. Oftentimes, the groups who are marginalized by conventional development policy are not the ones who are going to have access to this funding. And also this funding, as the discussions around REDD+, reducing emissions from deforestation, forest degradation, et cetera, as a lot of those discussions have pointed out, sometimes these tools could actually be mechanisms of further oppression by removing people from their traditional lands, for example, by privatizing forest areas. And so that is the component for me where it really becomes a concern, because while you have on the one hand a move towards, for example, titling indigenous land in Latin America especially, but also in parts of Asia, for example, you also have this trend towards further privatization. And if climate finance becomes a tool for privatization, a tool for this concentration of power in the hands of elites, rather than a mechanism to actually confront the fundamental structural problems that cause climate change in the first place, well, we're not actually going to ever solve this massive shared problem.
Right, and it's so interesting hearing you both speak. I feel the roots of critical development geography. It's a lot of the same old stories and the same old sort of outcomes. But Chris, you used the word, and I can't obfuscate.
Obfuscate, yeah.
Obfuscate, and that's what the finance mechanisms do, right? You're not. It's these colonial relationships and reinforcing uneven power structures in ways that we can't see. in many ways.
Right.
Which sort of takes me to the next thing, like trends in the field. What have you, either of you, noticed within climate finance justice? I mean, we're all talking about these very different mechanisms, right? Like green bonds and insurance is very different from RED or any sort of forest carbon offsets. Like I study carbon offsets broadly, but they all fit under this umbrella of climate finance. And so this is a way to sort of connect the dots between these various like empirical contexts that we're doing our research in. But I'm just I'm curious what you have seen in this field that you're interested in, that you've noticed, like how are we cohesively articulating a field of climate finance justice?
Well, it's interesting you use the word cohesively, because I think one of the strengths, and I think our special issue does this, is that it sort of pushes against the definition. And even though the climate finance can be very broadly defined, say within the UNFCCC, like any financial flows to, that supports adaptation and mitigation, I think that our special issue, and I think that work is increasingly looking at not just sort of the positive aspects of finance used to, say, facilitate the climate change mitigation adaptation, but also, you bringing justice to any aspect in which finance has climate change implications. And so challenging, the continuing ability to insure coal plants, or the fact that coal subsidies can, are a substantial comparison to how much is for renewable energies, right? And so it's not just looking at sort of the positive aspects, or like the so-called positive ways that finance has been using, and sort of saying how are they falling short, but like how also are the continuing finance flows that undermine climate change and lead to unjust aspects because of climate change, right? So sort of saying, like, if finance is so important in how climate change is manifested and dealt with, let's look at the full scope of what climate finance is. And then I think of another aspect that sort of broadens it, which is that Emily Williams has an article in our special issue where she looks at lawsuits around loss and damage payments. So this is a case where, and you could think about like, New York, Massachusetts suing Exxon. It's not just like climate finance is what states willingly give under like the framework of the UNFCCC or the Green Climate Fund or something. It's like money that's actually extracted, from historical polluter and ongoing polluters. And so then the justice argument is wrapped up in the lawsuits and so on, right? So it's not just like, oh, we're doing a good thing, and it's like, how dare these climate justice people like critique our well-intentioned RED programs or whatever. But it's like, no, sometimes you have to like pull unwilling money, money out of unwilling polluters. And there's a justice argument around that flow, because there's a historical responsibility they have to pay their climate debts. Right.
It's historical responsibility. It's climate debts, like you say. And then it's also like, are we allowing people to continue business as usual because they've paid for this?
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And I think for me, building on what Chris has said, because I agree with a lot of just the diversity of what comes under climate finance and really delving into some of those mechanisms, Lauren, like your work has done, but also trying to kind of understand the diversity that gets called climate finance is one thing I think is really interesting and important. And there's a lot of empirical work that's coming out that's really helping us understand the diversity and potentially, problematic elements of what we call climate finance. The other element for me is where we see a lot of questions around reparative justice, transitional justice coming into the fold, because so much of discussion around environmental justice and climate justice to start really felt like it was procedural and it was distributive. And it was basically who gets the money and how. And I think when we're really thinking about justice in its myriad forms, it's so much more than that. And so I think that we're seeing much more interesting work trying to get into what would it mean, kind of like just transition work in the context of climate finance. And so I think that's going to be really interesting as well.
Laura, you've really touched on this, and it's a conversation Chris and I had 4 years ago, which is like, there are all these different conversations of what climate justice is. Is it procedural? Is it like, like how money, like distributive? And that it's actually so much more complex than that. and a lot of that procedural versus distributive, I think, was coming from the global North and frankly from a lot of white male scholars in North America. And now we're realizing that, you know, we need to look other places and decolonize our reading lists and look at how other people are thinking about justice, not just in this way that sort of makes sense to political scientists or something like that.
Right, and I could say also how the challenges to the standard way of doing finance. You know, I think about, Laura, your work of like the Mesoamerican Territorial Fund. I mean, this is like finance. You know, if it's just like if you're in like, as long as you're still within capitalism, finance can still be fine if it means a transfer of money. But when you tie it to certain like performance-based results, like when you sort of take on the language, and this is like where critical development, like if you stick it in standard like neoliberal governance, and then finance becomes a kind of strict tool to enforce certain things. You only get payments if you do certain things. I mean, finance doesn't have to be of this form. I mean, it's not, as long as you have like money and you're moving money around, it could definitely be based on other criteria rather than just like, you know, like a lot of the climate finance is for-profit development of renewable energy, which is just like forestalling capitalist crises, right? I mean, it's just, in that case, I mean, it's supporting ongoing capitalism. And finance also needs to be, not only justice, but finance needs to be reimagined as something that as I began, I started to think, well, there can be often something very contradictory about finance and justice in the way finance is currently done. It doesn't have to be, right? We don't have to get rid of capitalism to have just finance. We just have to remove, we need to remove finance from these, you know, these elite banking institutions that have historically constructed it and deliver it under certain conditionalities.
And Chris, you touch on sort of a crux of one of the, sorry, Laura, one of the justice issues that I see, which is that these financial mechanisms as they exist now require people to enroll and behave in certain ways in order to actually receive funding.
Right.
And you know, there's this dichotomy, like when you're at the UNFCCC, there's sort of activists who can get in, and they're always saying, WTF, where's the finance, right? Like where's the Green Climate Fund? Are people actually following through on their commitments, and is it being distributed in the way that, you know, actually helps people adapt to climate change or mitigate their impacts of climate change? But then I think once you get the Green Climate Fund money, you know, there's a whole other range of justice, which is like, are you behaving in the way that like this European entity that's based in Korea wants you to behave to receive your money? And I think, you know, this is a lot of what this subfield offers, this type of scholarship and a space for this inquiry.
Well, I was just going to go off of Chris's point of finance could be more just, even if it isn't, even if it is still within this capitalist system, and even if it isn't going to lead to a full transformation or revolution or what have you, it can still be better than it is. And I think for a lot of the folks who are on the ground facing, you know, increasing droughts, who are facing increasing incidences of extreme weather events, you know, for those folks, if they had actually just, they're hoping to just make a life and a livelihood, in addition to maybe seeing a change in the fundamental system. And so finance could be more just, even if it is not in the service of undermining the entire system, right? So I think that's one element here is you know, understanding what the folks who are trying to get a toehold in this actually are asking and wanting, and differentiating that sometimes from what are the more the louder discourses, perhaps. So that was one thing that Chris made me think about. And I think the other thing is also very much, Lauren, reflecting your point, I called my article Becoming Fundable, because
that was so great.
For these Mesoamerican groups, it was really about trying to put forward this idea of an alternative way of doing finance that didn't make them have to fundamentally change how they worked and who they felt they should be accountable to. And that was not that they should feel accountability to these banks or these finance institutions or development organizations, but that as Indigenous organizations, as campesino community-based organizations, their accountability should be downwards. It should be to the people who elected them, or who are coming to them to seek advice or to seek support. And in order to get climate finance, they had to be paid and transform into something that didn't reflect their values, didn't reflect their relationships to the land. And I think that's really important. Who deserves funding is one part of this question, and how they deserve funding and what they have to sacrifice to even come into the room, come to the table when it comes to climate finance.
And that's why I think we need, critical scholars looking at this stuff for those 3 questions that you just posed at the end. Absolutely. It's not just like a nuts and bolts, how does this work, right? There's behavioral aspects to it and social aspects to it. And I don't want us to go too long because I know people are watching and they want to watch a lot of talks. But the last question I wanted to pose to you two is where do you see the field going? And I think you guys actually touched on that a little bit with saying, like, we can reimagine how finance is done. But if you want to talk a little bit more about that, or have you seen any interesting research that you're excited about, that you're inspired by, whatever we could talk about this for hours, clearly, but what's your hot take on climate finance justice?
Laura?
I can go.
I'm looking at you. You can't tell.
Right. I can go.
We're all staring at each other.
Well, I'm really interested in this infusion of tech into environmental governance. We're seeing it a lot in the US. So a lot of these financial mechanisms that were originally developed for the global north to invest in the global south through the clean development mechanism, through RED, things like that, are being reinvented in this sort of north-north context. And I talk about this in my article a little bit. But now, even since I wrote this article a year ago on, I can't even remember the name of the article, but since I wrote on on carbon accounting, I've seen a boom in tech interests in carbon offsets. So, carbon offsets kind of emerged in 2007, and then they kind of fell out of favor when people realizing they weren't working. RED wasn't as successful as it planned. And then after Paris, big oil starts putting a lot of money into forest conservation, and there's a resurgence. And now there's this whole other resurgence, and it's not just about trees, it's about soils, grasslands, things like that. But I think we really need to watch the fact that tech CEOs can stake dominant knowledge claims on carbon sequestration and finance, and then they get a ton of money behind them. So they get Microsoft money, they get Amazon money, they get venture capital to enroll these projects. And a lot of them are things that we as scholars have watched for a decade and know are problematic, but they're being reinvented and they have Silicon Valley money. So I think it's really important to watch that in this space. And I hope to be able to do some research on that in the next year or so.
I have something similar.
Can I jump in on that, because I do think. Oh,
no, go ahead, Laura. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say that the tech side of things I think is really interesting, both in terms of what you were just talking about, but also in terms of who's using what tech in order to say, for my line of work, right? Like, this is a forest, it has this value because of the carbon it has. So how are things like LiDAR, the use of drones, how are these kind of competing knowledges about what there is that is of value come into play when we're going to decide on who merits finance? And this is actually one of the directions I'm going in my current work, is trying to think of these kind of competing uses of emerging near Earth observation technologies in questions of forest governance and climate change. So I think that's a really exciting, interesting area to talk about further.
Yeah, your stuff sounds great too.
So, and then the other part for me is just pushing forward on this question of justice and how do we really understand justice in these different arenas. So, Chris.
One area, and maybe it's something I'd like to see more work in, or maybe I'll try to work on it. It's just that as we're confronted increasingly with really hard trade-offs, and the use of finance to coerce people to, and obviously obvious justice or injustice dimensions of this, but coerce people to make decisions that are favorable to ongoing capitalist development that aren't in the best interest of the people, but that they're desperate for finance because of ongoing climate change, that they'll make decisions against, well, maybe differently than they would if they weren't coerced. And so I just read an article yesterday, again, about this index insurance that is being tied to sort of incentivizing or buying off countries that are resistant to solar geoengineering. And because solar geoengineering can have these unforeseen consequences of like increased flooding, because they can't predict how the hydrometeorological cycle will respond to, basically reducing the amount of sunlight through adding like sulfate to the atmosphere. And this is out of a very influential Harvard solar geoengineering group that's been going on for a decade at least. And so the idea is that they're small and developing states would get a reduced premiums if they sign off on solar geoengineering, right? So kind of buying them off. And so I think increasingly as we see these really difficult trade-offs where people are, geoengineering is all about maintaining the status quo of like industrial development, but like trying to like really hanging on and trying not to change, but then using finance to sort of short-term buy people off to, to sort of maintain the status quo as much as possible. I think that's an area that I see increasingly happening, particularly in insurance. That is just, the way that the justice is completely disregarded in that literature is, I find, alarming. A lot more work to do.
Yeah, a lot more work to do. I feel like a 20-minute, 25-minute conversation is never enough, but I'm very grateful. So Laura Sauls, Chris Knudson, I'm Lauren Gifford. Thank you for listening to us.
Yeah, thank you.
Talk about
Have a good
climate
conference.
Yes, enjoy your conference.